How has the mining sector evolved this year over the last year? Kendra Johnston, CEO and President of AME, is here to discuss the opportunities and challenges facing investors today. Kendra, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for being here. And you are a geologist by trade, and now you're involved with the AME. We're going to be talking about the AME in just a minute. But first, can you give us a rundown of what you think the top challenges are facing the junior exploration sector today?
Yeah, of course. So, obviously, I think one of the biggest challenges is COVID. Of course, safety in camp has always been a top priority for all mineral explorers working anywhere in the world. But with the added challenge of COVID, there's, of course, extra policies and regulations that need to be followed, and an added step to make sure that we're not only protecting all of our workers, but the communities around us as well. I think one of the other challenges is just the changing culture in the world, the idea of a green future and where we're going with that. ESG has become such a large topic, specifically this year, just with everything going on in the world, and really pushing that envelope forward, specifically here in Canada, where we have the ability to push that envelope forward. And really taking into consideration and looking specifically at the mineral explorers and what they can do to help and push that forward.
Okay. Now, you've been involved with the industry for quite some time. Can you tell us about COVID specifically? Has the industry faced anything similar to COVID in the past in terms of having a widespread shutdown, a widespread decrease in production that was more or less forced upon the industry? Has that ever happened in your career?
Oh, certainly not in my career, no. And I struggle to think beyond that. For an example, it's a once in a lifetime event, right? So no, not that I'm aware of, but I have to say the mineral exploration industry has just done a phenomenal job all throughout the summer and into the fall. We actually didn't have a single case in a mineral exploration camp in British Columbia, and we ended up having one of the best years in terms of dollars raised and dollars put into the ground in British Columbia. So proud of the industry for the job that they've done throughout COVID, and now it's just a matter of making sure that we can continue that into 2021.
Well, how were they able to react to this unprecedented event if it's never happened before? What was the initial reaction back in March 2020?
Yeah, the initial reaction was definitely tentative. It was uncertainty. It was creativity. We pulled in a lot of those new regulations. We worked really closely with the provincial health officer here and the government, the Ministry of Energy and Mines, and then industry, of course, and really looked at where those challenges were, where the pinch points were, and what we could do. So some of the things are really simple. By the nature of what we do, we are socially distanced in our day-to-day lives. So, you think about mineral explorers, you're out walking across a mountaintop somewhere, collecting samples. You are typically by yourself, or you have a partner out there with you, but they are, 50 meters away. They're certainly more than 2 meters away from you. So it really comes down to a camp scenario and transportation. So how do you socially distance in a helicopter or a truck? And then how do you house 25 people in a remote camp and manage to keep people separated? So it's simple things in some cases, like hanging sheets, plastic sheeting, or even bed sheets between different bunks, circling out so that you don't have everybody eating dinner at the same time, making sure that you're cleaning your tools. It's those little types of things that make a really big difference. The other one is traveling through communities and making sure that we're not bringing the virus from a city center up into a remote community and then eventually into camp. So some of the things would be getting an expediter to bring food in, and instead of bringing the food into camp, drop it somewhere and then having camp folks go and pick it up. So a lot of things like that were implemented, and I think they're things that will continue to be implemented forevermore because they're really great things that don't necessarily cost extra money, and they really do help keep any virus, whether it's a seasonal flu or a regular cold, out of camps as well.
You mentioned that last year was great for raising capital, and I know the sector has been boosted by a rising gold price. Now the gold price has kind of flatlined a little bit since August, September. Do you see capital raising to be equally easy, shall we say, this year as opposed to last year?
Not quite sure easy is the right word, but I do think as fruitful, perhaps. Last year there was $422 million put into the ground in British Columbia, which is a fantastic year. It's about the highest year since about 2012. And so, money raising was very, very difficult last March, April, May. had to get on the ground, had to prove ourselves as an industry. And then, of course, with the rising commodity prices towards the end of summer, it kind of took off there. So it'll depend a little bit on gold and silver and copper prices for us specifically here in BC. But generally speaking, a gold price of $1,850 is pretty good. So that we should be able to raise money in that ballpark of a gold price for sure.
Right. Now, you brought up ESG. It's kind of been a buzzword over the last few years, but there's been a lot of definitions thrown around, some confusion as well. Can you clarify and maybe help us define what you think ESG means?
Oh, sure. So ESG means a lot of things to a lot of people, but very simply, environment, social, governance. From a mineral exploration perspective, it's really about starting with some very simple things, some baseline studies, some baseline environmental studies, looking at the wildlife in the area, the water flow of the stream, the background chemistry of the stream outside your camp or on your property, wherever you happen to be. The social piece, again, here in Canada, it's really a lot about the general public, the local community that you're working with, and the local First Nation that you're working with. Understanding your interactions with them, your partnerships with them, and how to bring that forward. It's also about the social interaction within your own company and within your own employees. And then the governance piece has been shifting a lot too over the last years. We look at adding diversity to boards, whether that's women or other underrepresented groups. We look at governance in terms of putting out policies around some of the environmental and social concerns that we're seeing. And then at the end of the day, it's really having a discussion about what we're doing related to those three things, and talking about it in news releases, talking about it in corporate presentations, not just once a year in a sustainability report, but having an honest conversation about it at any point throughout the year.
How much of this implementation of ESG policies is required by law now? Or is it mostly just a corporate standard that the industry wants to adopt?
Yeah, so I mean, some of it is certainly required by law, and most of that are the environmental and to some degree now the social things, and even there's some governance there in the Securities Act, but they all kind of fall out in different places. So the Mines Act, the Mineral Tenure Act has some of those things. Your own property permit has some environmental and social pieces. The BC Securities Commission, of course, and IROC have some government pieces, some governance pieces as well. And so they all are included, but at the end of the day, it's really a practice that needs to be led from inside, and mineral explorers need to put their best foot forward and present on those topics and be proud of what they're doing, because they are doing a great job.
Mm-hmm. I think investors really just have one question when it comes to ESG, especially those who might not understand it as thoroughly as yourself, is what's the point right now? Why approach ESG just from an investor standpoint?
Yeah, because it's the right thing to do, quite simply. You always need to protect the environment. You always need to protect your people, and you need to be making decisions in an orderly way to be a good corporate citizen. So all of those things really are making your company better. They're making a better investment, and they're creating a social license for you to be able to move a project forward and add certainty to a project. So from an investor standpoint, it's about de-risking. And a company that is doing it well and doing it right is certainly de-risking that investment for the investor.
One of the counter arguments I've heard from investors is that the implementation of ESG policies might actually be more costly for miners, especially at the junior level. Some smaller miners may not have the capital to implement ESG on a wider scale. And so it might actually reduce their margins and bring up their costs. How would you respond to that?
Yeah, I disagree with that for sure. I think there is certainly a cost to it, but ESG is there's a flow to it, and there's different degrees of how much you want to dig into ESG, and you can always do something. There's always a very low cost initiative that you can take on any one of those three topics: environment, social, or governance. Certainly, if you want to jump in and follow a set of standards that are out there, and there's lots of them, from TSM to IRMA to all kinds of things. And if you want to follow those to a T and go above and beyond, like far above and beyond, to things that are probably larger than where your company needs to be at, then yeah, it might be cost prohibitive, but there's no need to go beyond to that level and do things that a major should be doing when you're a junior explorer. So just the fact that you're putting those policies in place and that you're talking about it and that you are encouraging your investors to ask those questions and understand what's going on, that's not cost prohibitive, and that's something that anybody can do.
Okay. And you've worked primarily with Canadian companies, right? Do you think American companies are following the same trend as well?
So many of the American companies are actually based in Canada and working in the States. So yes, they are certainly following the same trends. I think the same conversations, of course, are happening in the States. They're maybe at a slightly different place, but yeah, those conversations are definitely happening and will continue to happen.
Okay. And what are some of the opportunities? We talked about the risks. What about the opportunities facing the mining industry this year?
Yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot of conversation this year. We've talked, one of the other emerging themes, of course, is this low carbon future and a green economy and all those types of things, the battery minerals, of course, and how do we get involved in that? And I think there's a few different places. Certainly, there's the critical minerals strategy that goes right across the U.S. and Canada. And I think we have a real opportunity to jump in on that. I mean, for us here in British Columbia, copper certainly is the focus. It's identified as a critical mineral in all of the critical mineral lists that you can find out there, whether it's Canadian, American, or international. But there's lots of other critical minerals as well. We have a ton of nickel here in both British Columbia and Ontario, for example. There's lots, and again, there's lots of opportunity to really search out some of those critical minerals and put a little bit more of an emphasis on those. So I think there's a huge opportunity there and to increase that conversation.
So during the AME conference, what are some of the major themes or trends that investors were really interested in for this year? What are, as opposed to last year, that maybe didn't happen?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And with Roundup happening, the second and third week of January, it really is a bit of a trendsetter for the year. So really interesting to see what those conversations were this year. And, on the technical front, I go back to this idea of critical minerals. There was a lot of conversation about those from not only a technical perspective and geologically in terms of where we find them and how do we find them, but also from an investment perspective of what are they worth and how do we value them and who's looking for them and how do we sell them. So some really great conversations there. ESG, of course, we had a specific ESG session, but I think what surprised me more than anything was that the conversation of ESG actually flowed through almost every presentation that we had this year, which to me is a bit of a game changer. That's, it's something that we've talked about and, like you said, been a buzzword for the last few years, but I don't remember a year ever before where it's been a consistent all the way through all the presentations. So that was really interesting. And then the other discussion we had on the last day of the conference was about diversity and inclusion and where we are as an industry on that topic and what kind of interactions are people having and where can we improve? And of course, so many conversations in the world this year about diversity and making sure that people feel safe in their own communities. So that was a really important conversation for us to have.
Okay. And how does this translate to growth? So investors would like to know some of the fastest growing sectors within mining. You mentioned critical minerals, base metals. I wonder if you think the critical minerals and base metals will potentially outperform precious metals this year.
Oh, that's an interesting question. I guess it's certainly possible. Not necessarily my area of expertise, but copper, silver, gold are always, they're landmarks for me. They're things that will always hold value and that we'll always need. So certainly my safety zone would be to stay with those. But critical minerals, I do think are going to take off, and whether that's this year or next year, I think it's going to take a little bit of time still for investors to get comfortable just with exactly what critical minerals are and how we extract them and what that market is actually going to look like in the long term. But I certainly think they're emerging.
Well, just from the perspective of raising capital for junior miners, do you think the critical minerals sector and the miners involved with those minerals will have maybe an easier time attracting capital this year than, let's say, some of the junior gold miners?
Yeah, maybe not easier than the junior gold miners, but I think easier than past years for sure.
Okay.
Critical minerals are certainly a topic with the larger investments and the larger investment houses and the idea of where we're going and where we're moving. And there are so many companies now on the investment front that are really interested in that space, and we need that area to grow. So I think anybody who's looking for critical minerals is going to be very well off and quite able to raise capital this year.
Okay. Are there some companies specifically you've worked with that investors can look at in terms of?
The one perhaps that I would point you to, and it's because they are a great example of a BC explorer, would be FPX Nickel, doing some really interesting things here in British Columbia. So I would take a look at that one.
Perfect. And finally, tell us a little bit about the AME.
Sure. So AME is the lead advocacy association for the mineral explorers based here in British Columbia and either working here as well or working internationally. Our mission is to promote and protect the interests of mineral explorers. And so that ranges the gamut from helping on an advocacy perspective to fight for their interests with the different levels of government. But it also means to promote the industry to the general public and try to get folks out there to understand the need for minerals and metals and in everyday life. So, how much copper is needed for an electric vehicle versus a regular combustion engine vehicle. It's 4 times more, by the way. The fact that your toothpaste it comes from minerals and metals as well. So getting across that message of if it's not growing, it's mined, and that's a really important thing for people to understand. And then, of course, we work right across the province and right across the country as well. So touching every community out there from an economic perspective and creating jobs in many of those communities as well.
Okay. Well, Kendra, I want to thank you so much for being on the show today and giving us your time. That was an excellent update on the industry. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
And thank you for watching Kitco News. Stay tuned.